To begin with, we'll begin by acknowledging that the land that we're gathering on today virtually is the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. June, Christina, thank you so much for coming. Welcome. My name is Gino Di Domenico, and it is my absolute privilege and pleasure on behalf of Tocofino and Shift Change to welcome you all here today. We're delighted to have you with us to participate in and share in our second annual Shift Change event. So I thank you all for being here. The fact that you have taken your time out of your busy days to attend and to listen serves as a reminder to us all just how important this is. Shift Change is committed to actively support and positive and sustainable change for our industry by creating an avenue for dialogue on the opportunities that exist in an effort to inspire people to hopefully take action and create meaningful change. This year's focus is diversity and inclusion in the hospitality industry. We want people, regardless of race, creed, gender, or circumstance, to achieve their full potential in the hospitality industry. And our task is to try to make this possible by working with professionals who can guide us in the right direction as a unified industry. We're honored here today to have June Francis and Christina Henriksen, the co-founders of the Colab project, with us as two of these professionals. Both are esteemed specialists in their fields of equity, diversity, and inclusion for racialized groups, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing what they have to share with us today. I urge us all to prepare ourselves to be challenged, excited, and inspired. And before I hand over to you, Taylor Shabadiuk, our head of people and engagement at Tocofino, who will help us moderate this event and take a question, I would like to thank Taylor for all of his hard work that he has put into making Shift Change and this speaker series come to life. I wish we could all applaud and you could all hear it. I can all wholeheartedly say that he has been an inspiration to me and a force to be reckoned with when it comes to providing equal opportunities to all of us within our organization. I want to say once more, on behalf of Tocofino and of Shift Change, welcome and thank you all for being here.
Thanks, Gino. That was really nice. Thank you for your kind words. Well, everyone knows my name's Taylor, and I'm going to be the IT person here today. I'm really excited to be the technical support for Shift Change, Speakers for Change. This ongoing virtual event's purpose is to create a space where people can learn from community leaders and industry professionals on how we can all work together to support diversity, inclusion, and equity within the hospitality industry. There's two amazing individuals here, June and Christina. Based on just my interactions, I've learned a lot already, and I'm really excited to learn more from today's session. Really quickly, just for the sake of time, there's a few housekeeping items we should address. First is you're encouraged to learn more about Colab and how you can work with them to support your journey in building a more collaborative, equitable, and inclusive workplace culture, both for the people that make up your teams and the communities you operate in. I'm going to add that link in the chat here, and check it out. You can also go to shiftchange.org to get links to learn more. You'll notice that video and audio is only enabled for those presenting, so don't worry if you're panicking right now and you're an attendee and thinking your video's on. That's not the case. And you're invited to ask questions throughout this today's session. At the bottom here, there's a Q&A button. Feel free to submit your questions, and we'll save some time at the end of today's session so we can answer some of those. The session is going to be recorded just for transparency's sake, and we'll use that recording to share with the attendees here today, and if you want to share with some people as well. And you're also encouraged to learn more about Hogan's Alley Society, the organization of choice by today's presenters. Learn more about the organization so you can learn about the mission, how to get involved. And everyone here is also encouraged to donate if you're able to. And learn more. But without further ado, I'm going to step aside and pass the virtual stage to June and Christina, and I'm really excited to learn from you both. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Gino and Taylor. We've never had such a very nice and warm invitation to join you here. And we're excited. We're both really excited to be able to be here to help kick off this virtual conversation that seems to now be the start of a whole process here, and especially around how to strengthen racial equity, inclusion, and in your industry. And hopefully we can also learn. We got probably a lot to learn from you. So we're going to make sure that we speed through our presentation so that we have time for some questions and back and forths at the end, hopefully. So I'm Christina Henriksson, and June Francis. We're the co-founders and principals of the CoLaboratorio, and you already mentioned a lot about what we do, and that we work with organizations across sectors, I should say, but also including the hospitality tourism sector, to help leverage and really support and leverage the full strength and full potential of diverse talent and stakeholders for more equitable and inclusive workplace culture, whether it's programs, design, strategies, and also collaborations with external partners. And I should say next, June. She's in charge of the slides here. This is just a little bit of a symbolic. We try to pull together a few things to speak to our own diverse racial and cultural spaces that we inhabit. I was born and raised in Sweden and came here 15 years ago as a settler from Sweden, and June from Jamaica. And so we could have added many more spaces, but I think it's appropriate to stay with the food theme here. And you have the succulent oxtail dish here in the middle, and also I should say that actually up in the right hand corner it's supposed to be Swedish gravad lax, so not sushi. Next, please, June. So we're just going to try and quickly, I'm going to hand over to June she's going to speak to a little bit more and help contextualize what we're all grappling with in different ways, the equity, diversity, inclusion in Canada and the industry, as well as the race and systemic racism overall that exists, and talking a little bit about the key challenges in your industry. And but also move on to what are some suggested solutions and strategies and to help create change.
So one of the things that I think we could start with is our current context. We knew that before COVID-19, this is an incredibly big, important and diverse industry employing 1.2 million people. And importantly, from the perspective of racialized communities and immigrants, it's often the #1 source of first jobs. And so the industry is an incredibly important place that many racialized communities find that they get their first opportunity, as well as immigrants to Canada, serving 22 million people every day. So these encounters cannot be divorced from the rest of the Canadian context. I think it's really important to see they're embedded in our day-to-day lives. And one of the things we saw from COVID-19 is how so many people have lost their jobs, particularly in this industry. And what we know is that from the research, we know that racialized groups are the most impacted. They're the ones that are usually last hired, first fired. They're in precarious situations in the industry. So it's going to be important for us to really think about this as the industry revives itself. Canada, as you know, and I know, is an incredibly diverse country. It wasn't always this way. And I think we, as a country, we have grappled with some of the issues. We're not, this is a society that was designed initially as a white society, but over various decades now, we've seen in-migration into Canada. And when you look at a place like Toronto as an example, you see, that actually the word visible minority no longer makes sense. The minorities are the majority. And so recognizing the changing nature of Canada, if you look to the right, you'll see the share of visible minorities in the population. In a place like British Columbia, this has actually rapidly changed just between 2011 and 2016. If you look at BC, you look at Ontario, these are now approaching a third of the population overall. So no matter where you are in these provinces now, you will see a preponderance of what Canada calls visible minority, and we'll try to unpack that later. But just to see, giving you some perspective on the size of different populations from a Canadian point of view. The other thing is, in an industry like why is this so critical to us in this industry? Why is understanding how to unlock the talents and the creativity and the ingenuity by creating welcoming spaces. I think it's going to be very critical in this industry to find ways to ensure that what we call visible minorities not only work in the industry but succeed, because I think we'll find that the very success and future of all of our organizations, whether they be small or large, will increasingly depend on this. And just to pick up on one thing here, because this is a very big chart, it's showing you how things have changed. And the blue line is Toronto. So when you look at the availability, and this is a measure of who is available to work in your population, who is available, and you look at Toronto, up to half of the available workforce is what, again, we call the visible minorities. The other thing to note here is if you look from left to right on this middle chart, what you see very quickly is that the population of visible minority are younger people. So as we look at the people we're going to depend on to run to work and to run and to be leaders, it's going to be increasingly this group. And if you look at the right-hand side, I want to point out something right now, and that is visible minorities actually, when you look at bachelor's degrees or higher, the blue line again, members of visible minority have higher educational attainment than non-visible minorities, quote white. So what you see here is that there are a lot of visible minorities ready to jump into leadership roles by training and by education. We know that visible minorities are concentrated in hospitality. You know that. The numbers bear it out. Food and beverage, 32% of the workforce is visible minorities versus 21% if you just go across Canada, a complete picture of Canada. Accommodation about the same. So very important sector. Now, the first thing I want to do is to contextualize the challenge in front of us. And for Canadians, this is sometimes comes as a surprise. So for many people in Canada, when the Black Lives Matter, sprung out of the United States and became a global movement, I think, and you see these are from Brazil, you see even in Japan, you saw there just about every country in the world had a major Black Lives Matter protest. The top two ones, the top right is from Montreal, and of course the one from Vancouver is here. I'm bringing this up to point out that for many Canadians, this came as a surprise. Many Canadians sort of looked on and asked the question, is it the same in Canada as it is in the United States? A wrong question, I think. But the key point that we're trying to get at is systemic racism a problem in Canada? And because of our long history of proposing ourselves as colorblind, many times we are swimming often in racism that affects the lives of many people in this country, but of course have told ourselves that it doesn't exist. And if we don't acknowledge a problem, I think we find that we can't deal with it. And just for the record, I just want to remind us that when it comes to anti-Black racism, Canada has figured out how to hide. Most of you if you went to school in Canada, you would not learn that Canada had slaves. In fact, from 1628 to 1834, enslaving humans was legal in Canada. And like everywhere else in the British colony, it was abolished only in 1834. Slaves existed. Very often we tell ourselves about the Underground Railroad, Canada being the rescuer of previously enslaved people, but actually Canada itself was a slave society, and many of the things that affected the United States and the history, we had segregation, etc. So let us at least start from that point. And I think we have to acknowledge, for example, the depth of systemic racism in the context that we all operate our businesses in. And our businesses reflect those values. They not only, but more importantly, often our businesses act to reproduce these inequities. So the way our businesses were founded on these very principles, and very often the way we operate them, we're not really clear. We don't always see it, but many of the times the very planned programs, the way we hire, and we'll get into that, reflect the wider society inequities. So it's important to see that. So if you look at the Black community in particular, and I think I'm going to focus a lot there today, because of course we had Black Lives Matter earlier today, and I think it may be a good time to really just focus on this community. If you look at hate crimes, and this purple dot reflect the Black communities. Hate crimes based on race or ethnicity. Black people were more likely than any other racial groups to experience hate crimes. So that's that purple here. If you look at all these other charts, you see a very similar thing. And I'm going to just grab a laser pointer here to make us see this. Unemployment rate, 12.5, the highest of any group. So not all visible minorities experience the same level of disaffection, but I want to show you, if you look at proportion of with low income status, white Canadians, very low percentage in the low income status. Other visible minorities are 22%. Again, the Black community, 23.9%. Average total income, and this I think is the most telling of all the charts. If you look at, if you're not a visible minority and you come to Canada, you actually see that you're over 3 generations. You start off often at a higher income, and by the 2nd generation you go up, and actually you sort of stay in a stable place. Here is what happens to Black Canadians. They start at a lower level when they come into the society, no matter what their educational attainment is. They actually go down in the 2nd generation. And by the 3rd generation, the gap between white and Black Canadians and white Canadians remain. So they even having been born here. And this is what systemic racism caused, because you can't kind of shed your race in Canada. You have to continue to wear it. And that's the impact. And I'll just go on in the interest of time. So this is important to note. So when we come to the industry itself in hospitality, it reflects and it's born out of, and the experiences that research shows and the people we work with and deal with, we see the same kinds of things showing up in the workplace, showing up in the ways customers are treated, and showing up over the long haul. And these are like, we show up in terms of biased policies and practices that impact some groups more than others. We see harmful comments and harassment tolerated to a very high degree, by the way, in hospitality. And so we see poisoned work environment through jokes, negative attitudes, even stereotypic ways in which we ask our employees to operate, and then we turn around and provide. And none of this is intentional. It's just what we're inheriting. Many times the approaches and modus operandi of the society we're in. Some of the experiences of physical violence, even in the workplace, or even as customers, Black consumers feel that more astutely. Hiring practices, whether it's in the questions you ask, etc. And we're going to pick up on a few of these, and the overrepresentation of certain groups in certain parts of the industry at the bottom and in certain jobs, and not in management. So let's take some of these up in terms of the hospitality industry itself. Then we'll get to some of the solutions. We know from all of the evidence that there's an overrepresentation, and this is one of the most serious things, in back of the house for racialized communities, and the idea that when it comes to the front of the house, and in what is seen as the respectable roles, the fine dining, or the people who are supposed to represent the aesthetics of the brand. Very often, this is where we see the racialized difference come up, and racialized communities are hidden in the back. They're given the work that others, the manual work, whereas the more esteemed jobs up front they find unattainable. Harmful comments and harassment in the industry is I don't know how to put it. It's one of the most significantly reported harassment for workers. So as racialized employees working in the industry find themselves all workers, right? Let's face it, it's a service industry. We have to deal, staff have to deal with a lot of complicated issues, but racialized staff find that they are targeted more, that they get sexualized more, that they're hypersexualized. As Black servers report very high levels of comments that are microaggression, daily basis, everything from where you from to comments like the sweeter the berry, the darker the berry, the sweeter the juice. These are comments made to women all the time. We like chocolate. These are what often people think are funny, but the point is that it creates a very difficult work environment for people. And so we see the creation of what we call a poisoned work environment. Jokes that everybody thinks that, oh, it's just a joke. And so one of the things that gets reported a lot are jokes about the coding. There's a coding that goes on behind the scenes about racial groups in the kitchen, and often it's to relieve tension, but a tremendous amount of tolerance for negative jokes. And what we know is that racialized people need a job. They often say very little, but it's deeply offensive, inappropriate decor, stereotypical representation. I've seen this where, people are not aware that certain costumes are offensive to certain groups, and nobody pays attention to to some of the things that are said. And one of the big stereotypes I know is around tipping behavior. The research shows, in fact, that some of those are not actually factual, but because people think certain people are going to tip less well, they treat them worse, and of course they tip less well, and it becomes a reinforcement of a stereotype. So often, if we think something is going to happen, it self-fulfills itself in the industry because we actually act in ways to make it happen. So dress requirements, you know, many of us know that there's a tendency in the industry to assume that this is a kind of dress code for women. Young women are often hired to symbolize and sexualize the workplace because, again, service industry, the perceptions that having certain visual appeal is critical to success. And yet we actually know that that doesn't always turn out to be true. So people who dress in different ways, and I'm obviously showing somebody who dressed quite differently, don't even have the opportunity to get many jobs because they're seen as not reflecting the aesthetic values. I want to make a point about emotional labor. A lot of racialized communities that we talk about this emotional labor. And here is what emotional labor is. When you're constantly in an environment where you have to put up with other people's perceptions of you, stereotypic questions, microaggressions towards you, constantly pointing out things about you that make you different, less than, or alien or foreign. Because you need a job, you perform what we call emotional labor. And this is it. Emotional labor is where you say to yourself, I have to put up with this because I need this job. And what that does to you is it demoralizes you. It makes you not happy to be where you are, and it actually has effects on your health. Aesthetic and gendered labor. As a Black woman, I can say many times where I become hypersexualized. I'm supposed to be you know, the epitome of a certain genre of sexuality. And it's what I call racial labor, where it's my job to show that I am a certain happy-go-lucky person. And sometimes if I'm not in that mood, I sort of feel like all of a sudden that is my job. I have to kind of act out this racial stereotype that other people have so that they can enjoy their meal. So all of these things, of course, compound in terms of creating environments that are not all that attractive for workers, and we wonder why sometimes people don't thrive. And to get the best, of course, we want people to feel they belong, to thrive, to want to be there, to be happy, to bring their best selves, to feel beautiful, whoever they are. And then let me come to this myth of the colorblind service. Most management actually feel that they sort of believe that most people that come into a service center, whether it's hospitality, accommodation, food, fast service, food and beverage, etc. They believe in Canada that they actually provide a colorblind service. But I tell you, most racialized customers, so this is a third point, you know, how your staff is treated, how the company represents itself, but also how do you treat your customers? Are you truly treating your customers equally? Are they experiencing the same joy in your establishment? Let me just start by saying that hospitality industry is the original industry that grew on segregation, okay? White spaces and keeping certain spaces white itself was the value of hospitality. So you found that hotels didn't allow Black people in, or that Black people were brought into, until quite recently, we couldn't even stay in certain places in Canada. Little known fact for some reason. And when we went into restaurants, where were we put? Because if you see, if too many Black people come into a certain restaurant, or other racialized group, indigenous people, it might change the look of the restaurant. So segregation was a very purposeful strategy of many in the hospitality industry. Because you see, Black people were supposed to be the servants, not the ones served. And that notion, I mean, the number of times I have been in big hotels, going in my very fancy suit to a conference, when somebody will come up to me and said, could you tell me, could you serve me something? In other words, I'd like to eat something. And if I'm thinking, why did you think I was a server? Well, because this is so deeply embedded in our brains that, you know, people want to take their luggage for them. Without even questioning why they're actually doing that, because of the deep-seated idea in their heads that the Black people, dark-skinned people, are the people that are served, are serving, and that the people, and so we don't provide the same level of treatment. And there is historical facts to this. I want to get to the rest of this presentation, but I just want to bring up a couple of things. This is a sleeping car porter. And up until the 1940s, this man would go across on the railway. The only jobs Black men could get in Canada were actually in the sleeping car porter. And they were brought to Canada and allowed to serve on these, on the railway coming across Canada. But guess what? There was no place on the train for them to sleep, and they weren't allowed to eat in the restaurant. Okay? So the only time they could do either one of those two things, they had to stay ready, sometimes for 48, 72 hours to serve the clients. And they were to rely on tips to get their way through. And when they stopped at the end of the line in Vancouver, guess what? There was no place to stay. So that's the history of this sector. I bring this up because I work for Hogan's. I'm the co-chair of Hogan's Alley Society. It's a Black community that was in Vancouver, that got displaced by the city of Vancouver. And what our mandate is to redress that, to work to bring back and steward the block, to bring back the businesses and restaurants and accommodation and housing to be stewarded by the Black community, because we got erased from the city by the actions of the city. And so that's what we work towards. That's what our goal is, because we think it's so important to have a community. But let me just show this Vice Chicken Shop. This was where this was a Black chicken shop in the Strathcona area, where we call it the Hogan's Alley block. And part of what got this place, of course, were all these businesses and Black businesses that try to go into the hospitality industry often have a very difficult time. And this is another important thing to note. And so when they displaced the community, not only did they displace families, as you see to the right, but they displaced all the businesses that could have been thriving. And here's a final point. This is the only place in Vancouver that the Black sleeping car porters could sleep, because Vancouver was a segregated city that included a house that still exists, where the Ku Klux Klan would march up Granville Street. Some of you have a $10 bill, and on it is Viola Desmond. She was excluded. If you look at, I always say, how do you ignore stories of Black resistance? When there was a $10 bill here, we carried that bill, but I hope we all know the story that Viola Desmond was a successful Black business woman, but she was jailed and fined for defiantly refusing to leave a white-only movie theater in 1946. So just reminding us of this history. Toronto was, many of you may have seen this, Toronto restaurants ordered to pay $10,000 after asking a Black customer to prepay for their meals. This is a kind of daily aggression that we get asked. We get, in the old days, I'd get asked to sign my credit card 3 times. And so when we look at this, you know, the places where we see racism show up, we see it show up in the company in terms of racial job segregation, that is some jobs only for one group and not the other, in terms of hiring, firing, and promotion. We see it show up in terms of the staff, how they're treated. I hope I've given you some examples of that. And we see it show up in terms of our customers, the treatment of customers based on race-based service. So I wanted to get to this. How do we create change? We will need to transform. We need to think deeply. And I'll just turn it over to Christina and say this. One of the things I think we need to all conclude is that there is no neutral ground. That right now, you look at this industry, all have to recognize is that this industry reflects and over-reflects in some ways the reality in Canada of systemic racism. And so there's no neutral ground. If you're not working to dismantle it, if you don't have positive action and change, you're working to support it. So there is no, if you're doing nothing, you're actually reproducing it. So we need to move towards transformative change, and I'll turn it over to Christina, who will take you there.
Next June, please. So we are looking at here and addressing these issues, and it's a long-term commitment. It's not something that you may be doing overnight, and it seems a lot of different things need to be addressed. And of course, we don't know exactly where you are on this. It's a journey, but this is, of course, there are many ways in which, just some examples of the many ways in which you can begin to address these things. And we can maybe come back to this one and instead keep going, just to give a few examples of the most critical parts. One of the things around trying to deracialize restaurant cultures is to get and implement a zero tolerance policy. In terms of trying to forbid, certainly microaggressions, the use of code, racialized language, and treatment of black clientele in restaurants, but also thinking about, of course, the staff side, how do you get to enforce and put procedurally just processes in place that comes all the way from onboarding, staff understanding what the issues are, and also create a process, can be an anonymous one, in terms of how to escalate if this is happening to you. And so, of course, that's one of the things. Next June, please. When it comes to hiring practices, thinking about, for example, can you screen in, proactively screen in racial and culturally diverse applicants and have that in your pool? Do you acknowledge potential biases by looking at the interview process and the kind of questions you're asking, even down to that level of the interviewing process? Can you perhaps standardize the interview questions but also include the type of questions that would indicate and maybe ensure, especially when it comes to applicants for leadership and frontline management positions, to ensure that those you've hired also have this commitment for racial equity. Training managers on, it's not always easy to think through the kind of questions you should be asking, and maybe adopt a more of a scenario-based approach to interviewing, laying out what would you do in a situation such as, next June, please. What does your leadership look like? Be critical, and we know that a lot of racialized staff profiles, of course, are in entry-level jobs. Can you deliberately create career pathways that are more leading from that place into leadership management positions? Weave it in with, take emphasis on the-job training, and also try stay away for really focus specifically on job requirements, not be stuck or get stuck in what are our typical portraying certain leadership styles, or portraying certain ways in which you end up casting your leaders to that should have certain skills. And set some goals for this. What should we do, and can we see if we're making progress on getting more people into these types of roles? So measuring. Next June, please. Walk the talk. If you're talking about the importance, and you may have some public commitments on your websites and everywhere around being an employer of equal opportunity, you're signaling that you're having a culture that's inclusive for everyone. This is, of course, an example to have a warm, welcoming environment for all customers. It was actually Starbucks. They've typically had their brand built around the whole thinking that we are those that can create this kind of semi-public space, the third space from being away from your home or your office, where you're allowed to lounge and just hang out. And of course, as we all remember, a couple of years ago, there were two black men that were arrested just for doing exactly that, lounging and wanting to use the store's bathroom. So really needing to walk the talk and carefully think about the actions. Next. Pay special attention to privilege and power dynamics that this has created. So for example, speaking, and I'm now speaking as part of a dominant group of being a white person, white woman, we often forget that through our own lived experience, which is of privilege, we've had the power to define and shape what these standards or the norms and practices end up being in working life. And so there's this white normalcy, and it's like this, you can liken it to an unearned advantage for us as the group that's in the majority. And that in itself then becomes an obstacle for those, for other racialized groups. And so the example could be, for example, in hospitality, how things have been defined around what's fine dining, what's the meaning that fine dining has taken on, as opposed to others, ethnic foods or exotic dining experiences. And so of course fine dining very much centered from a Eurocentric perspective, but it's these things that aren't necessarily so visible for being in what June was going through as well, of course, for this non-visible majority. And there are also these unspoken set of rules, promotion criteria, hiring. It's all hidden often. I spoke about the example with Starbucks too, throughout even the design of physical spaces, aesthetics and branding. So next, please, June. Diversity training is important, but it shouldn't look like this. Often we hear or see these experiences or people focusing on trying to get this otherness into having people, Black, people of color, Indigenous people speaking about their experience. And of course, it's important to have this listening and learning about and from groups with lived experiences of racism, but it's not for them, as June was talking about, this whole also adding into the emotional labor and burden. It's not for them to just do all of this heavy lifting and instead, so as we're saying, it's important for the experiences of the majority, which is around privilege, needs to be included. So learning needs to go both ways. And only then may we be able to shift the norm, the standard and existing practices. So what does this look like? It's it's about being participatory, previously excluded racialized groups, being able to actually be part of influencing, shaping solutions. And it could be anything from creating a new menu to digging deep around what do our hiring practices look like in the organization. Next year. It's also about being collaborative, but also like reflect collectively and try and unmask more deliberately the dominant groups' historical privileges that we can then see probably bubbling up in a lot of places, the culture, our behaviors, our policies and practices. And last but not least, connect and reach out beyond your organization. So with working with your community and diverse suppliers, partners, recruitment partners in so many different ways. Next year.
So I think in summary, we have this, you know, we took this from a restaurant publication. It was such a beautiful picture of the dining, the opportunity, we call it, the dinner table of opportunity is what it is. This is a dinner table of opportunity for us to address issues related to our customers, the suppliers, the community, and our workforce. And we know from all the things we see anecdotally, as well as the research, if you want a more a more robust reason to do this, that these all lead to increased productivity. It increases effectiveness in the community. It leads to better quality of life for your workers, for you, and so there's lots of dividends for us to take this opportunity to innovate. And so we use this word innovate because oftentimes we have to change. We have to work together. And that's what Christina was talking about, making sure that the people who are most impacted are centered and in this new approach that you're going to take, because I think there's a lot to be learned and a lot to be gained. And as we come to the end, I want to share with you a metaphor that I would like to leave with you. And it's about our experience. One of the places that Christina and I have done a lot of work is in the country of Peru. And in Peru, very people don't know this, but 2 of the top 20 restaurants in the world, you know, according to these rankings, people I'm sure can differ, but 2 of the top 20 restaurants in the world are in Peru, are in Lima, Peru. And much of this has been attributed to the fact that due to a tough history in Peru, people came into Lima from all over the countryside, and they brought with them their different traditions. They collaborated together and brought together all of these different cuisines and infused it together into what now is kind of the Peruvian cuisine. And so we see these restaurants really able to see the value of diversity, the value of including the different perspectives and cultural traditions in the table, in the cuisine. And yet, these very restaurants have not yet understood that they can bring the same diversity of talent to the rest of the hospitality industry. And I assure you, you'll end up with the same kind of results as they did with their cuisine by doing so. Thank you very much.
Well, that was very impressive and such a massive topic to cover in 50 minutes is what we got to hear. But thank you so much to the both of you for doing this, very informing. I do have a couple questions here. I'm going to try to summarize to the best of my ability. One is sort of leaning in the direction of, moving people of color, moving the BIPOC community into leadership roles. You know, similar to, I guess, the what's the word, the contestment that we received during affirmative action in the early 2000s from people who are not of color saying, you know, well, you know, I'm up for this opportunity for promotion or whatnot. Why did so-and-so get the job above me? And how do you deal with that in the, you know, in the restaurant industry, promotions and that sort of thing?
Can I flip that question, and then I hope Christina will help me? Can I flip the question? So first of all, when you look around at leadership right now, and you notice that the leadership is primarily, let's say it's a lot of white people, do you think they arrived there because of because they were the best qualified in the country for these jobs? I just want to think, I want us to all think about that for a moment. Or is it that in fact there was an advantage, that in fact we have created systems that give advantage to certain groups to rise? So what this is all about is to some extent saying, let's be fair now. Let's not just give one group the advantage. Let's create systems and processes that allow other people into that space. So oftentimes it's in fact that somebody who is probably more qualified has been sitting there and excluded because they didn't look the role, because the role looks a certain way, or they don't act the role because we have something in our heads about who leads. And so, in fact, the qualification that you think you have may in fact exclude their experience and their qualification. So we're not saying to produce, you know, to promote unqualified people. In fact, very the opposite. We're saying there's so many qualified people who have been excluded by virtue of these obstacles. Christina?
Yeah, and adding to that too, I think we find that businesses who start looking also at creating more diverse, even at that stage where you're creating more diverse recruitment pools, and you have, for example, people working with thinking through high potentials and everything, that they immediately also have a different kind of it's the selection process that ends up being very fair and transparent, that is starting to have those kind of results. So not affirmative action per se, but it's just the very process of being very focused on and very observant on how these processes are actually functioning within the organization. And I think adding to that too, look at who is hiring in your organization, who does the hiring. And some organizations looking at that and having introduced even more diverse teams hiring have started to get into the space where they're suddenly finding themselves, again, without affirmative action, that they're having more BIPOC people on the way in career paths leading to leadership and management positions.
Great, and thank you for that. The next question I have is around, and also in my experience, in June, to your point earlier, is that a lot of the BIPOC community has, in my experience, worked in the back of house, and it's been, you know, predominantly white in the front of house. How can a manager, an owner, anybody make those jobs in the front of house more attractive, or how do we go about making it known that, you know, we're accepting of BIPOC individuals in the front of house?
Your question is the answer, you know, in some ways, because very often we create these unwritten rules, and even the people who are applying self-select themselves because they want a job. And if they notice that your organization only put people in certain places, they want to increase their chances of being hired. And often they even self-select themselves out of those front So actually what you have to do is be proactive. So proactive in terms of first having a policy that very clearly states that you are welcoming two groups of people in every job description you put out. So you make it really clear in those descriptions, an explicit statement that you are welcoming to people of color, from LGBTQ communities, etc. Right? So that people know, disabled, that you have already thought about it and you have made that decision. Where do you recruit? That is important too. Often we have referential recruitment, right? So the people who are already working there bring their friends, right? So their friends tend to be like them, and to self-conscious, and we know from experience, by the way, that those things create isolations in the workforce. So that they then you have a whole workforce of people who come from the same milieu, who then tend to create an environment that exclude if you only have one or two people out from outside the group, then they feel isolated because you've created this kind of clique environment. So somebody once said, if you see somebody who is, if you're the only Black person in the organization, just assume that they just made an exception from their usual discriminatory practices. You're just an exception. So anything else to add, Christina?
No, just looking at also looking at other job postings and how other organizations describe or put out there those that are doing things proactively already at that posting stage, where you include that kind of language and also encouragement of groups to specifically apply.
That's wonderful. Again, thank you. And Taylor, did you have a question?
Yeah, I got one here. It's someone's asking about how they can go about creating that dialogue in the workplace to unearth if there is, systemic discriminatory practices or other barriers that exist for people.
So this is probably the most important question. Not the most, but it's a very important question, because employees often, they need to feel safe, first of all, to disclose these things. And you have to ask yourself as managers, before you start that discussion, is this a safe place for people to actually, are you prepared to hear? Do you wish to hear? And will you do something about it? The worst possible thing, and the thing that will shut this down the quickest, is somebody who labors and creates the emotional pain of explaining their pain to you. And then, first of all, you don't change. So that's, or you're not really open, you're actually defensive about it. So it's this thing that Christina and I talk about a lot, about creating safe collaborative spaces. And when sometimes you really actually need third parties to do that sometimes, to be honest. This is a space where it's often very difficult for your very first start to say, tell me about the ways in which I have treated you badly. And because it's just, you're not prepared sometimes to hear, and the person isn't safe. And they know the moment they start explaining to you that they've just kind of gone down the list of promotables. So I think start off, if you feel that you've not had this openness, by perhaps engaging with other people to have some of these conversations. And then that creates the beginning of a dialogue. And secondly, the commitment has to be there. Do not be performative about this, because again, people are quick to understand. They know if you're honest, if you're open, if you're willing to change. So make sure you know why you're doing it as well, I think, because sometimes people get into this space, they really don't want to do it. They're not convinced, right? They actually aren't convinced. And I notice that a lot, is that people hear, but they actually go home thinking, well, I know she thinks that the Black and BIPOC communities are as good, but I don't really think that. My experience is that we're better. And that's what's going on in their minds. And if that's what's still where you're still at, you're not ready, right? So if you're not convinced, the whole thing won't be a safe space and there won't be dialogue. So it's about reducing power. And I think that sometimes the best place to start is with some third parties helping along. Christina?
Yeah, and there might be people within the organization too that from certain groups that are maybe also willing to be a bit of that, take the lead as in being able to help drive something like this, or even to get it started. So even having conversations with the next group more broadly, and also acknowledging that there may be a whole range of different types of interactions that need to take place where, for example, I, as a white person, may not be the one initially that maybe June, for example, would be someone who take on a certain conversation, but then it could be a stepwise way of broadening the circle and broadening the trust for talking about these issues. And sorry.
No.
And also being very, very concrete, as in this, not talking about anti-racism broadly, but really always anchoring it in your own reality.
Yeah. And also being willing to see yourself and your own behaviors. Often people of color are cast as the ones that has to carry the burden of the conversation. It's about us telling you, let's say, what's wrong with the situation. But there needs to be some reflection, right? There needs to be some introspection. There needs to be an acknowledgement. And so it's not just about working on other people, it's about working on ourselves. And also remember, these are systemic things. I always think this is important. All of us, let me just be quite straight about, all of us internalize white supremacy. Why? Because that's the society we have been brought up in. We have all been taught to esteem whiteness. White this, white food, ballet, so that ballet becomes high performance, and African dance is kind of low performance, or European art is fine art, and African art, even though it's informed Picasso, is primitive art. We've all internalized this so deeply that when I sit on the bus, I go on a bus, maybe I don't sit beside the Black person because I think maybe they're going to steal my wallet like everybody else. Why? Because that's been internalized in me. So I think, not making it so much about us as individuals, but thinking about the system that we have inherited, that has created these structures, and we're just part of it. And if we're committed to seeing, then we can dismantle it. But I don't think we should become so attached to because if not, you just become defensive, and then I become offensive, and that gets us nowhere.
That's great. Thank you so much for that wonderful answer. Wonderful ending to this. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up here. I know it's 4 o'clock in restaurant industry. Everybody's ramping up for dinner. You both do such wonderful work. Thank you for taking the time today to do this here with us. And with everybody who joined, thank you all for joining. You can go to our website to find out more about where we're donating our money today to Hogan's Alley, and as well to the Colab with these 2 wonderful people. Thank you again so much for coming. Taylor, any closing thoughts?
No, thank you so much. I've personally learned an incredible amount in such a short period of time. Thank you. I'm just on that. I'll be sharing the recording. That's going to be available on the website as well. So if people in the audience here want to review it and dive deep in some of these topics and learn, but other than that, thank you so much. It was a great hour, and really appreciate your time.
Ladies, anything?
Thank you for some great questions as well.
And I look forward to meeting some of you at some point in the future, and good luck with your journey.
All right, wonderful. Everybody have a wonderful night, and thanks for joining. Good night.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.